Nearly every single video game ever made has an easy mode that you can access right now. It solves any puzzle instantly, gives you the most effective way to defeat any boss, and shows you exactly how to navigate your way through any obstacle in your path. But should you use it? Much like most people who grew up playing video games, I played a lot of Pokemon as a kid. But the way in which I played Pokemon was a bit strange. Back before the internet was as reliable as it is now, there were these guidebooks that you could use to find anything about a game that you wanted to know, and I followed them to a T. I wouldn't take a step in game unless the guidebook told me to do so, and I enjoyed it. Somehow. I did the same thing with the Final Fantasy series. I would play the games alongside videos to make sure I didn't miss a single chest, character, item, or weapon. It's thanks to this that I actually remember Final Fantasy III as one of the easiest games in the series, despite the fact that most people consider it to be the polar opposite. Playing games like this basically removes any agency you have, but it also removes most of the challenge. Of course, this is a bit less effective in a real-time game like Elden Ring, but it still works a lot better than you might think. For example, if you're struggling to beat Margit, you could do some research and find that you can get an item called Margit's Shackle to weaken him and make the fight easier. You could also find out that there's a subscribe button here and a jellyfish here, the latter of which is more than willing to take most of the damage for you. You could even watch other people complete no-hit runs of the fight to see the best ways to dodge each attack. Of course, this doesn't guarantee you'll win by any means, since the execution is still up to you, but it makes the fight significantly easier than it would have been otherwise. What I'm getting at here is this easy mode can be found in guides and other online resources like YouTube or, God forbid, Reddit. Any game with a large enough following has every bit of information on that game just one Google search away. But there are two things we need to address. The first being, is this the wrong way to play games? And the second being a question we'll get to later on that only you can answer. Let's start with that first question. I think the best way to play any game is the way that gives you the most enjoyment in playing it. But I do think it's important to consider what you're losing when you consult Google. First, you're losing your ability to go in totally blind, which can be a problem since when most people are playing games or just experiencing any media in general, they like to go in knowing as little as possible. Let's go back to Elden Ring again. One of the best feelings in that game is discovering secrets for yourself. Back when I first started the game, there was this unforgettable moment where I opened this chest and it took me to some mines. The moment I escaped the cave, I realized the situation was far worse than I initially thought. I wasn't trapped in some mines. I was in Ohio. This was one of my favorite moments in the game because of how much of a surprise it was. It was a total subversion of my expectations, and that's what made it so exciting. So much of that excitement would be taken away if I wasn't randomly tossed in the middle of this unknown land with no way out. With a guide, I'd have time to prepare for this, and honestly, I might not have even opened the chest in the first place. But surprise isn't the only thing that guides take away from you. Going back to that Final Fantasy example, I was happy because I was able to beat the game, but that satisfaction wasn't really there. Obviously, that's because I had no agency whatsoever. I was winning, but I had basically nothing to do with those victories. They were hollow. Part of what makes competition so exciting is the prospect of failure, and if you can't fail, what's the point in competing? That's why it feels so good to complete challenging tasks in games. That feeling of overcoming something that you thought was impossible is the very source of that gratification. But what if it really was impossible? Think about it, who's gonna bother trying in a competition that they can't win? While I do believe that just about every boss in every game can be beaten with enough time and the right preparation, sometimes the amount of time required might start to feel impossible. So when you reach that point, maybe using a guide wouldn't be so bad. Equally, while a guide removes surprises, not all surprises are good. Imagine a boss that takes an hour to beat that has a move that'll wipe your entire party unless everyone does a specific action on that turn. Assume this boss is just poorly designed and has no indication at all that this attack is coming. Now lastly, assume that this boss only does this particular attack at minute 59 of the fight. Losing like this and having to go back an hour would be pretty frustrating, but a guide would circumvent that frustration entirely by warning you about this before it happens. But the last and potentially most important thing to consider is you. What do you want out of this game? This answer is going to vary dramatically between both people and the games that they play. For example, in a game like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, I would like to go in knowing almost nothing. However, with a game like Final Fantasy IX, I'd like to know about the little things that make a big difference later in the game. Things like Zidane's thievery ability being influenced by how many times you've successfully used steel throughout the game. That way, I'll consistently use the skill with the knowledge that I'll be rewarded for it near the end of the game. But you also have to look at how much you're willing willing to give up. Every time you look up information, you're sacrificing just a bit of that surprise. Each time you look up a boss's weakness, you remove just a bit more challenge, and by extension, satisfaction. Pacing is something else that you have to consider. Imagine you're in the middle of a huge story beat and the game presents you with an extremely challenging boss or an especially confusing puzzle. If you get stuck, a bit of the momentum is taken out of that moment. How much of that momentum are you willing to give up for the satisfaction you'll gain from overcoming that challenge? I can't answer any of these questions for you, but I can answer the one I asked at the beginning. Simply put, I'd suggest using this easy mode whenever the game is no longer fun. There's this fine line between challenging and frustrating, and where that line is will vary from person to person, so let me know what you think. When, if ever, is it okay to use a guide or search for outside help in games? And speaking of games no longer being fun, check out this video on how to enjoy games again.